So, our next speaker is a programmer, game designer, and board game enthusiast who found his feet with his first commercial game, Guild of Dungeoneering. He's here to talk about sharing your game early and what that can bring, so please welcome Colm Larkin.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. My name is Colm Larkin. I come from Ireland, Dublin in Ireland. So I run a small company in Ireland, and I'm here to talk about sharing your games, sharing your work, and sharing early, sharing embarrassingly early, and why that can help and maybe even change how you work a little. So I'm going to tell you a story about how I got into making games and how I started sharing my work and how that changed everything for me. So my company is called Gamejam, and that's our studio. There's 5 of us now in Ireland. But I'm also part of IMMERT, which is the Irish Game Makers Association, which is volunteer run. And thanks so much, by the way, to Konsoll for bringing me here and letting me visit Norway, which is my first time here, and it's really been really nice to meet so many people. And there's a lot of similarities between Ireland and Norway in terms of population and kind of the stage we're at in our game industry and the friendliness of the community. So if you ever want to contact me about reaching out to Ireland, I'm very open to that. So I'm going to talk about how sharing my work led to success and kind of changed how I think about things a little. I'm going to talk a lot about Guild of Dungeoneering, which is the first game I made, first commercial game I made. And we made it with a tiny team, and initially with 0 funding. And we released the game in July 2015 to a lot of success. So I'm going to just show you a little bit of that success, and then I'm going to go back to the beginning and show you essentially how sharing really early work kind of helped lead to that success. When we released on Steam, we got featured by Valve on the front page. We, on launch day, we were in the top sellers list. We were peaked at number 6. We were featured in print magazines, which felt sort of unreal to me at the time. This was PC Gamer. We were on a lot of really big YouTube channels. This is still the biggest, or the video with the most views for Guild of Dungeoneering. It has over 400,000 views now. And funny story about this one. This is Total Biscuit. He made that video, and then we shared it on our little Facebook channel, which I used to run by myself, obviously, at the beginning. And this is my mother saying he was a bit repetitive too, which was one of his complaints about the game. So it's really nice that your mom can look after you still. Probably my favorite video on YouTube is actress Felicia Day playing with her brother. They have like a Let's Play show. And this video and their excitement about the game is something I now use as kind of like a pitch. If I'm sending someone info about what I've done before, I'm like, oh, just watch this video. We were on the Twitch front page. You can't really see it, but there were about 5,000 people watching streams at once of Guild of Dungeoneering being played on launch day. A year after we released, we ported to mobile, and this is the front page of the App Store on iOS. When we released on iOS, they featured us, which was crazy because that was shown to tens of millions of people. Take that, Peppa Pig. It's not all positive. I think I could give a whole talk about the psychological ramifications of reading all of your Steam user reviews, which I have, and I wouldn't recommend. So I want to take a step back and talk about what I did in the beginning, how I ended up making games. This is probably quite hard to see, is a copybook from when I was 6 in 1986. It says, we got a new computer game, I tried it out, but it didn't work. I typed a program into a blank tape, and I've illustrated it. You can see my art skills here. This is essentially how I ended up being a programmer. We had a ZX Spectrum in the 80s. It was our family computer, and back then it had a keyboard and you had to type programming stuff into it. Much later I went to university and studied computer science, and I became a programmer, but I never worked in games. But I had a deep love for games and I wanted to do it. So in 2008 I was 28 and I decided I'm going to do it. I'm going to start making games, but I'm going to be careful. and I'm just going to do it in my free time. And naturally, I made a kind of classic starting out mistake, which is I picked a project that was way too big. So what I wanted to make was a kind of turn-based tactics game along the lines of Fire Emblem. And it only looks nice because I was using free art. And I spent 3 years on essentially this prototype that there was nothing to it, and then I gave up. So I really had nothing to show for that time. What I switched to was an idea that was more exciting for me at the time. I'd been playing a lot of board games, and I started making a game that was kind of like fantasy Risk with special dice. That was kind of my idea. I spent 2 more years on this before giving up. And that was 5 years of my life, and I felt like I had nothing I could show for that time, and that was really frustrating. What got me out of that rut was essentially taking part in game jams. So Gamecraft still is a series of game jams in Ireland, and one game a month is all over the world. It's kind of a game jam on your own terms each month. So I started doing game jams, and after even just one day at a game jam, I had something I was more proud of and that I could show to people compared to the 5 years of previous kind of failing. And that was amazing to me, and it was really motivating. I think anyone who's taken part in a game jam, I mean, hands up if you have done a game jam. A lot of people. You've probably experienced the focused productivity of being there and everyone working, and if you're stuck, you kind of walk around the room and come back to your computer, really energized. And that's kind of the shared deadline, I think. Everyone being in the room, everyone finishing later that day. But there's a hidden bonus, I think, in game jams, which is you're forced to share your work. So generally speaking, once the game jam is over, you walk around, you play each other's games. And I think that is the other magical side of game jams. And in one game a month, because you're doing it on your own terms, that was missing for me. So I started doing one game a month, and the deadline helped. So each month I was trying to make something, and I was missing that sharing aspect. So I set up a group in Dublin that meets up every month. It's called One Game a Month Dublin, and the whole point was to just share and play each other's games. So I'm going to show some games I was making by myself, mostly in 2013. A lot of these are game jam games or one game a month games. And just have a look at the quality of what I was making, which is low. So this game was called Drinking Rampage. It was made for a 4-hour game jam, which is barely enough time to make anything. And you're the sprite on the left. The sprite on the right is the bouncer at this carefully realized pub. And there were random pints you had to kind of walk into to pick up. And the controls would start getting crazy as you got more. This game was made for a one-day game jam. It's called Seabird Plunge. And you kind of hammer the spacebar to gain altitude as a bird and then hold the spacebar to dive into the water, and you're just trying to catch fish without hitting the big yellow ones. This was made for one game a month. It was called Dungeon Delver. It was essentially based on a board game I used to play when I was a kid called Dungeon Quest, which is about kind of revealing tiles and trying to make your way through a map. So it was kind of a similar idea where you're trying to get to a treasure room. The following month, I made an actual physical card game. It's a drafting game. This one was called Captains of Industry. And it was a bit like the game Seven Wonders, if you've ever played that. Then I made a game called Super Happy Pet. And this was kind of the start of making joke games. And I did all the art for this one myself. In Super Happy Pet, it was like a virtual pet, a Tamagotchi. I mean, it looks like a 90s Tamagotchi, that style. But the joke there is no matter how carefully you look after your pet, they always die. So I really like joke games, particularly for game jams, because you don't have enough time to realize enough content to make a serious game sometimes. Which brings us to this. This is my favorite joke game I've ever made. It's called Futility Rpg. And the idea here is that I'm pretending there's a big RPG, and you just have to go through character creation first. So I'm one of those people that when I sit down for, like the new Divinity Original Sin just came out and deep character creation, I can spend hours in that portion of the game and have a great time before I ever play. Some people hate that and just want to play the game. So I was basically making a game where you had to keep answering questions about your character. They were always pointless and they always had sub-questions. And at every step, there was a random chance that got higher and higher that it would just pretend there was a conflict with something you'd picked earlier. So you picked smelling things quirk. Oh, that's not compatible with being an underground halfling. And it would roll you back to race selection and say, you got to pick something else. And always, there was this skip character creation button. And when you hit that, it would say, thanks for playing. You made it 33% of the way through. So it was a joke. Now, I shared this on Reddit, on the Dungeons & Dragons subreddit. And I just said, you guys might like this game. And that was the very first comment, which was like a minute after I posted. Someone got really angry. But a lot of people played it and said, well, it's not really a game, is it? Or they said, that's actually quite funny. One of my favorite comments is this bottom one, which was essentially someone played it all the way through without ever triggering the rollback, which was a really small chance of that happening. And then they came back to Reddit to say, well, that was weird. And they saw everyone else, kind of hit the joke. So I'd been sharing these games, and I'd been feeling much more confident about what I was making, and I felt like I was progressing. And part of it was that I was able to show to people and see that I was creating something of, some novelty. So I felt like I was more in the zone, and I decided to go back and take one of these projects and make it into a real game. So that's what became Guild of Dungeoneering. I took the Dungeon Delver kind of tile-laying concept, and I decided to work on it until it was a PC game I could actually sell. That was my goal. And also, I decided I would share everything about making the game from day one. So I would write about it, what I was doing, why I was doing it, and I would share a playable prototype of the game from the very beginning, even when it wasn't good for a very long time. And I thought this was something that kind of the bigger studios with their bigger budgets, they can't do this. So I, as a nobody, I don't have to follow those rules. I don't have to have a special hype cycle and have a more polished, bigger thing. I can just show this nothing thing and get people maybe interested in the craft of making it, which is what I did. So this was my idea for Guild of Dungeoneering, which I posted up on Twitter a few days after starting in October 2013. And this was a really cheap way of saying, is this idea even vaguely interesting? So this is essentially the hook behind Guild of Dungeoneering, that you can't control your hero. And it lets you get feedback on your idea before you even get working, which is really cool. So I have 3 main points about sharing that I think are really important. And the first one is about this. Your idea is not that special. It's not the first time it's been said here at Konsoll. I think Joel was saying this yesterday. So there's this romantic notion that you need an incredible idea to have a successful game. And I don't think it's true at all. I think the idea is just a little stepping stone, and it's all about execution and iterating on kind of where the idea draws you. The second thing that I think is interesting about sharing is that no one is going to steal your idea. So this is a really common fear, but I think it's worse than that. I think it's actually an excuse we make to ourselves so that we don't have to share our ideas or show what we're doing, because it's scary. But I really think no one is going to steal your idea. Even if someone saw your idea, saw my tweet from early on, before I was really making anything, what they end up with is going to be really different to what you make in the end. I mean, Tim was showing quite a few different iterations just before this talk for his golf game. So if he had shared his idea and someone said, golf game, it's going to be so different. By the time you kind of discover your final gameplay and what your game is about and what you actually release, it's very, very different. And even if someone sees that you're sharing and it's really cool and they want to just steal everything you're making, you're in a really great space. So you have this essentially public record that you were there first. That if someone completely copies your every detail of what you're making, it's okay. So this happened to Vlambeer from the Netherlands. They had a free Flash game called Radical Fishing, and they were bringing it to mobile. And a different company said, that's a cool game, and they made a complete clone of it on mobile, and it was quite successful. And they went to the press and said, look, we've been cloned, it's crazy. And they got so much press, so much free PR, and so much attention. So when they released their game, which was called Ridiculous Fishing on mobile, It was a huge hit. So there's always that opportunity. So the third thing I think is very important is to share embarrassingly early. And embarrassing is a very important word here. If you're sharing things you're proud of, it might be a little bit too late. It's important to force yourself, I guess, to share things you're not proud of that are rough and you know they're not right, they're not finished. And there's many reasons for this. You'll get feedback at a more basic level. So if you're sharing something really rough, you'll kind of get feedback on the basic concepts, not on the kind of more polish-related things. And it could save you lots of time because you won't go off developing something that ultimately you'll cut. But most of all, I think it helps you get over the fear of sharing. So, it's very natural when you're making something, you're going to compare your early work, your rough work, to the very best finished things of the people you admire. That's completely natural. And of course, there's going to be this huge gulf between those two things. But if you force yourself to share, you get over that really quickly and you start absorbing all the positive things of sharing. But anyway, back to me. So I decided to share a playable version of the game from really early on. This is what it looked like, and talking about the process and asking for feedback. And I started doing it on a website called TigSource. So TigSource is a kind of indie games focused website and has a devlogs area, which is for development logs. And I was inspired to go there because I used to go and read devlogs from other people. This one's by Notch. He made a game called Minecraft. And right there in the beginning, this was 2009, click to launch applet. You could play the first version he put up because it was built in Java right in your browser. And that was really interesting to me. And he got so much feedback on it. And eventually it blew up, but it hadn't blown up here. And there were other people writing on TigSource and doing this that I found really interesting. Fez, so Phil Fish for Fez was doing it. And probably the most interesting one is the creator of Papers, Please. So if you Google TigSource Papers, Please, there's this whole thread that's like a gold mine of information, of behind-the-scenes information about how that game was made. It's so interesting. So I started doing the same thing. And this is the early days of sharing, which is a subset of marketing. So the early days of marketing your game. And it's grassroots work. You're trying to get from 0 people who know about your game or know about you to just a few. That's your chance to start building a following, a fan base. And everyone tells you that's really important, that's key to your long-term kind of sustainability. But it takes a long time to build. And I think it takes consistent effort over that long time. And so starting really early kind of gives you a head start there. And this was my first bit of press for Gilded Dungeoneering on indiegames.com. And it was like 3 weeks after I started working on it. And this screenshot they played the demo for much longer than I had ever played because there wasn't enough gameplay. But they played it to make a nice screenshot. Another thing I started doing was I started asking for pre-orders. So I asked for money. Don't be afraid to ask for money. So my goal was to make a game I wanted to sell. So if you're doing the same thing, do not be afraid. Ask for money. So I basically found it incredibly motivating. As soon as people actually pre-ordered the game, I owed them a finished game. And that was really motivating. In those long kind of depressing slogs, that part of development where you're worn out and you can't keep going, you still owe people that game. And that certainly kept me going. The primary reason I did pre-orders was actually to force myself to do other important marketing tasks. So I had to put together a working website for the game. I had to write up the pitch, the text explanation of why it's a good game, put up screenshots, a video. I put the playable alpha there on the webpage. And these were tasks I knew I needed to do. So I said, I'll do them all, and then I used the Humble Bundle widget, which is a really easy way to take pre-orders for your game. itch.io also do one. Really good and really easy. And I didn't expect anyone to buy it. That was fine. My expectation was, at a certain point, I would stop updating the free demo and then start having kind of like a private alpha. And I thought that might be when people who were interested in the game might pre-order it. But that's not what happened. So this is the first 6 months of me having that pre-order widget. About 100 people pre-ordered the game. And You didn't get any kind of bonus for doing it. I mean, you'd get a copy of the game if and when I finished it, and that was it. So I used to email everyone to say thank you, but also to say, why did you do it? And a lot of people got back to me and said, it's just a kind of like a vote of confidence, a financial +1, that I like what you're doing and I want you to keep doing it. And it really worked for me. So sharing your work, and I said it's a subset of marketing. I think of marketing your game, marketing your work, as one of the important pillars of game development. So right up there alongside programming, art, game design, sound and music, writing, all of them. I think marketing is there and should be as important as those other things. And I think you need to think of it right from the beginning of development. So when you choose your name, even when you choose the kind of game you make sure there's something interesting, a hook, a really good hook, which is just that little thing that might make people pay attention, a little bit more attention to your game. So our hook was, it's a dungeon crawler where you don't get to control the hero, which is a bit weird and causes us loads of problems in terms of making the game fun. But it's interesting. People wonder, oh, how does that work? And the other thing that you can do to make things really much easier on yourself is to pick an interesting visual style. So I teamed up with an artist, Fred Mangan. This was his first concept art for Gilded Dungeoneering. And our style was this kind of pencil drawing on graph paper, like you might have done back in school. And there's so much out there in terms of visual style in like traditional art that isn't being used in games right now. And if you're making a game, or if you're an artist, or if you're not, team up with an artist and go and steal or get inspired by traditional art, because there's this like vast amount of interesting styles that are available and aren't being used yet in games. And Jane's talk yesterday, where she was talking about the strength of brand, and Firewatch do it so well. But she had that kind of wall of Steam capsules, and you could pick out Firewatch immediately. It was the same with our screenshots. So if that wall was screenshots, a lot of games kind of look the same, and ours really stands out, which was great. So that was the concept art. This was kind of what the game looked like after about 6 months of work. And I was starting to share the slightly more polished version of gameplay. So, actual art was in the game now, and some of the gameplay systems were coming together. And at this point, I basically decided, this was all, up until now, me working part-time. I was a software engineer, and I was doing this part-time, and it was hard. I felt like I was never going to finish the game. So I wanted to give it a go, to go full-time, work for myself, and go for it. But that is a scary moment. And it was difficult even for me. So I was in a lucky position in a way. So I gave up my job. We still had my wife's salary to support our family. But it was still pretty scary. We'd just bought a house in Ireland. We had our first baby on the way. It was 6 months until the baby was due. And I felt like if I didn't do it now, I would never do it. So right after becoming a new parent for the first time, I knew it's going to be very difficult to do something new then. So I had this kind of 6 months window. I was like, I'm going to go for it. But it was scary. And people like my parents and my wife's parents, they thought I was crazy. You're giving up like a solid job to make this nonsense kind of. And I don't really have advice there around how to make it less scary. Well, we'll move on. But anyway, I went for it. I felt like it would be okay. I could go back and work in programming, no problem. But actually, even a few weeks into it, I felt like this is so much better. I really hope I don't have to. Then I started doing stuff like put the game through Greenlight. We got greenlit by Valve. And I started making, for the first time, a concerted effort to pitch to the press. So I found like about 100 different journalists and pitched them individually what our game was, and we had a new trailer and we were on Greenlight. And that was great. We got a few more bits of press. But actually what was really good about that was like iterating on my pitch, which is like, what's cool about the game? Why is it interesting? And every time I did this, from that first website I did to kind of this stage where I was trying to pitch press to later, it always got slightly better. So it's another great side effect of starting really early, is you go through a few different kind of revisions of all of that. Around this time, I realized I really need to get the game to some kind of game shows. So the likes of PAX, I looked at PAX and it seemed like that's the big place. I want to get there. But I was working with no budget, essentially. So I was trying to get into, there's some cool stuff like the Left Field collection at Eurogamer, and I think the PAX 10. There were these things where they're kind of curated space where they give free booths to certain games, and I went for them, but I didn't get into any of the big ones. So I got to, this is called Insomnia Game Show in the UK. They gave me a free booth, which is cool. And I got to another one, Game City, both in 2014. And that was cool, but it wasn't enough. So I decided to go and find a publisher to partner with, primarily around getting our game to the really big shows. So why use a publisher at all? I mean, it can be a source of money to pay everyone, to hire people. It can be like what I did for Guild Dungeoneering, to pay for all the expensive kind of marketing and PR stuff. And doing this is interesting, because again, you have to pitch them. You have to go to publishers and explain to them why your game is interesting. And if you've already been doing this for a while, you're better at it. And you've got ammunition. So I was able to go and pitch publishers who didn't know who I was. I've never released a game before, but I could show some traction. I could say, well, look, 100 people brought the game, sight unseen, pretty much. Valve greenlit us. Look at all these press articles, and here's my improved pitch. And one thing I would say about finding a publisher is it does take quite a while. So this was from back in 2014. I've actually I'm starting looking for a publisher again. So on Reddit, Game Dev, actually if you Google indie-friendly publishers Reddit, you'll find this list, which is basically my most up-to-date list of publishers that tend to work with small games. Pitching a publisher, it does actually take a while. So for me in 2014, it took from September through to January. It was about 4 months between these initial pitches, some of them just blind emails, and sometimes I'd tweet them and say, did you see my email? Around to people then talking to you on Skype and you showing them the game, sending them the playable version of your game. And then people are interested, send you contracts, and then you have to negotiate. It takes a long time. I ended up signing with Versus Evil, and they did a brilliant job. This was our booth at PAX South, which was basically a week after the deal was signed. And they brought us to these big shows and got us a lot of attention. We also managed to get a little bit of kind of an advance from them, which let me hire a couple extra people for the last 6 months, which was very helpful. So now we're kind of into the final 6 months before we launch the game. And we brought the game to a lot of big shows. We went to PAX South, then we went to EGX in London, GDC, where we had a press day. Then we went to PAX East, which was like the day after GDC. E3 in LA, which was basically the month before we launched. And then we did a couple after we launched as well. And this was kind of a point where the level of attention kind of ramped up, because there's such a big deal. So many people come to these, tens of thousands of people come to those shows, and not just them, but also press and other people like in the industry. This was from PAX South. Randy Pitchford, who's like the head of Gearbox who make the Borderlands series, just saw Gilded Engineering, thought it looked cool, he's tweeting about it. Also from PAX South, streamers started noticing the game. So this is a thing called the Co-optional Podcast. It's like a gaming talk show run by some streamers. And Dodger and Jesse Cox were at PAX South that weekend and played Gilded Engineering and were really excited by it. And that weekend they were on this show with Total Biscuit. We're telling him about the game. We're telling him, oh, you have to see this game. It was really cool. And those two streamers became like champions for us. So at the other shows in those 6 months, I kept seeing them. They kept coming over and bringing their friends who were also streamers, saying, come and look at this game. It was really cool to kind of get someone like fighting for you in that way. And I have an interesting story about Total Biscuit and this video, which it's still the biggest video on YouTube for our game. And essentially the timeline of how he ended up covering Gilded Engineering. So he first heard of it at PAX South. He wasn't there. his friends were there and told him about it. And then when it came to launch week, we did this thing. So generally speaking, if you want the press to review your game, you have this press copy, which is you send them the copy of the game a little early, so they have time to get someone to play it and review it and write up their review. So they have a review ready for launch day, particularly the big games. You know, that's what they get. That's the reason they do the reviews for you. They want to be there on launch day. People Google game name review, and they want to be in those first few hits. We weren't that organized. We sent out review copies 1 week before we launched the game. But we did this interesting thing. We also sent out that version of the game to streamers, and we gave them permission to stream early. We said no reviews until launch day, but go ahead and stream the game. So that was a new thing we were giving them, which was essentially getting to stream a game that their viewers couldn't play yet. So just this like little bit of extra interest. And they did. So Dodger and Jesse Cox were streaming the game. And then 2 days after we launched, there was another co-optional podcast, and Total Biscuit said, oh yeah, I got a copy of the game. I played it. It was mind-numbing. It's a bit of a killer to hear that. But immediately Dodger and Jesse Cox were like, no, play further. You're just right at the beginning. It gets more complex. And the next morning, I see this video. You know, what WTF is Gilded Engineering, and you know, I knew it can be overly honest, and I was like, oh God, this is gonna hurt. But it was really good. You know, he did spend like 5 minutes looking at our options menu, but that's okay. But it was interesting. He even said, like, basically, he had played our game and he wasn't going to do a video about it. And one of his friends, basically convinced him to give it a kind of a second chance. So I'm going back to this picture, which is when Valve featured us. So it says pre-purchase now. This was the day before we launched. So we did this thing where we sent out review code to streamers a little early, said you can play it early. We had actually opened pre-orders for the game the month before we launched. And the reason we did that was Versus Evil were talking to Valve and trying to leverage that into getting featured. So look, it's got traction. And it worked for us. But Jane made this point yesterday about Firewatch. That dilutes your launch a little. So particularly the day before launch, partly because of this banner, we got a lot of sales. And that meant, our day one kind of chart position was lower than probably it could have been. But it's kind of a chicken and egg problem, because getting featured on the front page gets you a lot of attention. So we had this banner up from the day before we launched for a whole week after we launched. It's incredible. So I think it's kind of important to note that there was no one thing, I think, that broke our game, that made it successful. Even things that were kind of turning points, like being at PAX South and convincing these big streamers that the game was interesting, getting on their radar. Even those things, they were only possible because of all the sharing and marketing work I'd been doing for like the previous 18 months leading up to that. Getting the publisher, convincing them we were right, all of that was made easier because of all the kind of iterative work I'd done. And that's how we made this tiny prototype into a big success. This is the team celebrating with some ice cream because we made an ice cream related expansion to the game. And now there's 5 of us working full time. We're paying ourselves salaries, which is crazy because that wasn't possible before we made the game. And funnily enough, we've started working on a new game. And I'm not sharing it the same way. I've just spent ages explaining how well this worked. And it's a little bit different when you have a kind of fan base and an expectation. So I'm actually really itching to get this validation again, to get people seeing what we're making and hopefully encouraging us. But I haven't done it yet. So we're making this game and we're just waiting till it's just a teeny bit more polished. When we've got cool golf gifts, maybe. So sharing let me stop wasting my life not making games and actually help me finish one and help that game be much more successful. And I really hope I've convinced you to share your work as well. So thanks very much. So that's my Twitter handle. And if you follow that through to my webpage, my email address is there as well. Always welcoming questions from anybody. And if you have questions now, I'll also love to chat to you.
Hey, I'm wondering, when it comes to sharing, what platform would you recommend? Maybe in 2017, what would you say is the best place for sharing your indie game and gaining traction and feedback?
Sure. I tried a few places. I would go to Reddit. I would go to Imager, TigSource, Twitter. I used to post with, game dev hashtags, Screenshot Saturday. I tried a little bit of everything. Long term, probably the best one was having that long-running thread. Even for myself, it was like a diary. So sometimes it would be like over a course of a month, just my posts 4 times in a row and no one answering. But then occasionally, a whole bunch of people trying something. And sometimes I'd just go back and I'd look. We're like, oh yeah, look, 3 months ago, how bad everything was. So, just this like public record of progress was nice. In terms of getting attention, I guess is your question. I don't know. I'm about to start again. Streaming seems a new thing. So streaming your development was a thing that I hadn't considered back in 2014. I've seen some people do it with some success, though it also seems super grueling. So be ready for that.
Hey,
Hey.
great talk.
Thank you.
When me and my company, when we were students, we were share early or at an early stage. But we found that it was difficult to get people understanding how to play your game. It would often ended up with them quitting before they reached any gameplay part because they didn't understand controls or whatever. Do you have any tips on how you managed to get that, or?
So I used share, the early version of the game was so basic that you quit out of boredom. You'd be like, okay, you play for a minute. I mean, I showed that example of the screenshot that took ages to make. I was like, wow, why did they play so long? But yeah, no, that's valid. I used to also bring it in person to game dev meetups in Ireland and watch people play and, ask for feedback, but even just be taking notes, like, took a long time to figure that out, need to work on that. So iterating on that process was really helpful. And then also leaving my laptop there and watching people play for a couple minutes at the start, which was what I would expect. And then, 6 months later, someone was playing for 15 minutes. I was like, because I still thought it was awful. But I was like, well, it's gotten better, hasn't it? So, yeah, you can try that. And that'll help you in the finished game, because teaching people the controls in a way that isn't reading a manual, it's very difficult, but very useful, yeah.
Hi.
Hello.
Are you going to use a publisher for the new game?
Yes, so I'm shopping around. I really liked Versus Evil. They were excellent. So I'm pitching them as well, but my contract is for Gilded Engineering, so I have this opportunity to kind of shop around again. So that's why I put that list together. So I've pitched everyone on that list. So I'm actively doing that right now. I guess why?
So I'm kind of doing something similar, like starting a new project and maybe try to get some funding to make life a little bit easier.
So this time I'm looking for a lot more money. We're trying to do a bigger game. There's 5 people full-time instead of 1 person part-time. We're pouring money into it that we had left over at the end of Guild, but it's not enough. So yeah, I'm trying to find someone to actually give us a bunch of money. I feel it might be a little easier because maybe it's less risky because we've finished something before. But I don't have a deal yet, so we'll see. That list, Google it, it's there on Reddit. It's a good starting point. There's about 30 companies that are open to games made from small teams. Anyone else? Oh, I heard there was another Irish person here. No? Hello. So I was at the pub on Wednesday night, and a few people said, "Oh, I met another Irish person." And I was like, "Where?" And they said, "Oh, he has a beard." Just did not narrow it down very much, Norway. I can say hi afterwards. There was someone over here. And someone over there. Okay.
Why aren't you sharing your new game?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think I could give a whole talk about it, but obviously once I start sharing. The main reason is we have a whole lot of people who played Guild of Dungeoneering, the finished product, and they now have hopefully will follow what we make, and have a kind of a level of expectation around quality. And if they see the really rough prototypes, much like I was showing here, they might think we started making shit games now. Excuse me. But we've changed our policy. We're not making this nice game that they love. Instead, we're making these really janky, weird games. So we've just thought about that. We're making a game that we think will appeal to the same people, which I think is a good strategy. And we're just trying to. I guess it's how you end up like Blizzard and having a huge show where you reveal your game. But I guess this is the small scale version of that. We're just making a slightly more polished thing before we really share it publicly. That said, I love pitching it in person, and I have the game here with me, and if anyone's talking to me, I'll share it with you because I want to get feedback. Yeah. There's someone over here.
At what point do you stop releasing free versions of the game?
I did it when I signed up with the publisher, and they told me to. But in fairness, they convinced me. They said, if you stop sharing, we can use that as a kind of hype. So people will see it at shows or hear about it because press will write about it, but they won't get to play it. And that, you're building that little tension there that when you launch, they'll be like, oh, gotta check it out. So I believe them. They're all right. But there's variations of that, like early access is I'm making the game, but you can buy and play it. So you can make a game that suits early access, and then you're selling and sharing the game as you make it. But I'm quite scared of early access, despite liking sharing.
Hi. First of all, it looks like a pretty awesome game. So I was
based on the early stuff.
All of it. It seems to me to be like a good fit for our physical board game. Have you guys considered making it as a physical copy as well?
Yeah, and it's inspired by physical board games. It looks like little paper tokens. I love board games. Board game design is, I think, the most exciting place for design right now. Yeah, we thought about it. We were trying to kind of, via our publisher, talk to board game companies that use Kickstarter, trying to figure out, does it make sense? I feel like we were just kind of on the cusp of success. If we'd been like 4 or 5 times bigger, it would have made kind of an easy sense to get someone to go and essentially make a board game based on this, and we wouldn't have had to do anything. If we did it ourselves, I feel like we'd have gone down this crazy rabbit hole of, printing physical things, and we wouldn't have been making digital games. So we didn't do it. Our next game is actually, again, also, it's even more like a physical card game, actually. So hopefully with that one we'll get to, because that would be really fun. It'd be really nice to have a physical thing.
How often would you update with like new versions of the game and stuff to keep people interested?
Well, the good thing is there was no one at the start, so I was kind of not beholden to anything. I used to update every time I did something, and I was trying to keep to kind of a weekly thing where I would work for an afternoon or a day once per weekend. And to be honest, it was really exciting to get to update it. I felt like I'd done something, and I got to write about it on the TIG source thread I was keeping. I was like, hooray, I did something. So that actually helped me work on the game. So really, anytime I did anything, I would share it, I would update it. It was really easy. I built it in Flash, which had problems later on, so we didn't port to consoles, for example, because it would have been too hard. But in terms of embedding online and getting that playable version and letting people play it without installing anything, it was really, really easy. Well, if you want to chat to me afterwards, I'm around. Thank you so much.